Yeah.
It's on.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining us today. I am Pooja Pandey, and I'm a project fellow with the education team at Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, New Delhi, and I welcome all of you on behalf of my entire team. The event today is basically hosting a launch of our study report, which is titled How Accessible is Education for Students with Visual Disabilities, which is an analysis of digital resources. Now, this study is an extension of some of our works, some of our previous works on accessibility of educational resources for learners with disabilities. And it specifically talks about the Diksha platform and conducts a systematic review of the accessibility of Diksha platform and the learning materials hosted on it. Details about the report and the study will soon be shared with you by my teammates in the coming sections of this entire event. Before we get started with the formal event, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the speakers as well. From our team, we have Nisha Vendekar and Tapas Bhardwaj joining us today, who will be mostly steering the conversations around the findings of the report. Nisha is the team lead at education with Vidhi, and Tapas is a project expert at Vidhi who is working in the areas of inclusive education. Welcome on board, Nisha and Tapas. We also have the privilege of having external speakers with us today. I'd like you to introduce Dr. Ruma Banerjee, who is the chairperson of Seva in Action, which is an organization based out of Bengaluru. And she is also a member of Central Advisory Boards on Disability, CABD, under Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment under Government of India.
Good
Thanks a
evening.
lot. Thanks a lot, ma'am.
Thank
Thanks a lot for agreeing to be with us and welcome to the discussions, Ruma ma'am. We are
you.
also expecting to be joined by Mr. Amar Jain at some later stages. He was supposed to join us now, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, he's running a little late. Hopefully, he'll join us later. Amar Jain is an advocate by profession and he's also a certified professional in web accessibility. In addition to that, we have Preeti and Nitika, who have been kind enough to help us with the sign language interpretation bit throughout the event. Welcome to the discussion, Preeti and Nitika. And lastly, at the back end, Jasmeet is helping us with the overall coordination of this entire event through the VCLP account. Welcome, Jasmeet. Before we actually get into the discussion, some quick housekeeping information for all of you. As an agenda for the event, we will start with Vidhi's education team presenting the report, how the report came about, the inception of the report, some of the research findings, as well as finally some recommendations to the report. The link of the report will be shared with all of you in the chat box, as well as it will be made available on Vidhi's official website. We'll ensure to share the link with you. We also have a PPT in place. We'd love to share the PPT with you upon your request as well. After the presentation of the report, research report and its finding, we'll move on to Ruma ma'am and hopefully Mr. Jain as well, where we'll have a moderated discussion on a slightly broader approach or a slightly broader outlook to digital education, accessibility, and the bits around it. This will be followed by a short question and answer and discussions round where all the participants should feel free to put in their questions, but the participants can also put in their question in the chat box at any time during the discussions. Uh, as mentioned earlier, sign language interpretation will be available throughout the event. PPT can be made available to you. This event is also being broadcasted live on Facebook, and we are also recording this event. Now, without any further delays, I'd like to request my colleagues Nisha and Tapas to take over the discussion and get started. Over to you, Nisha.
Thank you so much, Pooja, and thank you, Ruma ma'am, for joining us, and everyone else for being here today. So as Pooja said, we are here to launch our report on how accessible is education for students with disabilities. And with this report, our main purpose is one, to highlight the extent of accessibility, of inaccessibility, sorry, on the teaching and learning materials hosted on the center's Diksha platform. So just, sorry, yeah, visible to everyone, I hope. Yeah, so just to give you a quick background, Pooja has covered some of these points, but we essentially in June 2020 had written an entry called Making Digital Education Inclusive for Vidhi's briefing book on 25 legislative challenges for a post-COVID India. And in this, we essentially highlighted certain legal and policy gaps in the entire education sector, right? In terms of making education inclusive for students with disabilities. We know anyone in this sector, anyone embedded in this sector knows that students with disabilities struggle to access schooling even today. And this includes digital education. And specifically, students from rural India and socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds are the worst affected by this. With the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a huge reliance on digital education. And this is for basically globally, it's across all kinds of students, all kinds of teachers. And this essentially makes this question of digital education needing to be inclusive much, much more urgent. So really the study is situated within this context, right? We know that schools are not open yet. We know it might be some more time before they can be reopened. And even when schools are opened, it is very important for us to be very, very clear about what it means for education to be truly inclusive for all students. So that's really why we wanted to do this study. And, we're so happy that we can share it with everyone today. So the legislative framework in India, we have under the Rights for Persons with Disabilities Act certain mandates, right? And it is mandated that all public schools provide inclusive education for all students of, a diverse set of students, which includes students with different types of disabilities. And within this, Section 16.3 talks about making reasonable accommodations according to the needs of all students. We have Section 16.5 that talks about ensuring education to students with visual disabilities and hearing impairments, and that it's imparted in language and modes of communication that are accessible and appropriate for them. And Section 17.1 that talks about making suitable modifications in curriculum and in the examination system so that students with disabilities are able to participate sort of on equal footing with all other students, right? Despite this legislative framework, what we found when we did this study is that the Diksha platform, which is the digital infrastructure for knowledge sharing platform, this is a platform that the central government has hosted since 2017. The idea behind this platform is to host a variety of teaching and learning materials across subjects, across grades, across mediums of instructions and curriculum boards, and essentially for it to be a one-stop shop for all kinds of learning and teaching resources um, available online, right, for students across our country. And genuinely, the agenda of the Diksha platform is to make these resources accessible to all, right, by providing it on an open platform where access becomes easy if it's online. The idea behind the Diksha platform is for material and education to become accessible. However, in doing this study, we find that especially for students with visual disabilities, this is definitely not the case. And in fact, in October 2020, before we took on this study, a petition was filed by the National Association for the Blind with the Bombay High Court to raise this issue of inaccessibility on the Diksha platform. And again, just to stress, I mean, it's not just that the Diksha platform is a central government initiative. It's not that it hosts a variety of different resources, but because of COVID, this has been a platform that has been given a lot of attention. It has been pushed a lot. So governments across states have been encouraging teachers and educational institutions to rely on this platform for imparting education during the pandemic, which means that for all students, especially in public schools in our country today, the Diksha platform is an incredibly important source of educational materials and learning resources. And that's why it's extremely important. And again, why this petition was filed by NAB as well. It's extremely important that such a platform be 100% accessible for all students. So in this study, we essentially do two things. We try to do an empirical assessment of the extent of inaccessibility of the platform and the resources, the teaching and learning resources that are hosted on the platform. And I'll get into the kinds of resources that we look at and what we mean when we say extent of inaccessibility in just a minute. Apart from this, what we've also done is case studies with students, parents, and teachers, where we talk to them about their experiences of studying in schools with a visual disability, of teaching students with a visual disability and without a visual disability, but having students in your classroom that have that disability, right? So we try to get a sense of what their experiences have been like, not just with digital education over the last year or however long they've interacted with it, but also in classrooms prior to the pandemic as well. And in this presentation and in this event, we will mainly be discussing the first part of this, which is the empirical assessment. However, these case studies that we have, they are video case studies, and they will also be shared with everyone, and they'll be available on Vidhi's website. So for anyone who's looking to get a better sense of what inaccessibility looks like for students with visual disabilities and the kinds of challenges they face, we really urge you to listen to these stories because they were very, very insightful. So just before I get into the methodology behind this, we wanted to share with you a very short video that we created. It's just about 3 minutes long. And in this video, what we show you is actual learning materials from the Diksha platform, specifically e-textbooks hosted on the Diksha platform, and what it looks like for a student with a visual disability when a screen reader is not able to actually navigate these materials flawlessly, right? So in other words, when these materials are inaccessible, what does that feel like for a student with a visual disability?
During the COVID-19 pandemic, education has been disrupted for many. Students and teachers have been forced to increasingly rely on e-textbooks and online resources to continue with education. While students with visual impairments usually use electronic study material with screen reader assistance, they may end up depending on teachers, peers, or family support for navigating the inaccessible material. Due to current school closures, it would be even more difficult to go through these. Shouldn't the study material then be made accessible even more urgently? Let us take the example of two students, Ajay, a student with visual disability who uses a screen reader, and his friend Samir, who does not have a visual disability. Due to inaccessibility of the textbook, Ajay navigates a 8th class mathematics chapter on linear equations in this way.
5x equals 25, 2x3 equals 9, 537 2, 610 2, 2 2, yz plus equals minus.
Samir, on the other hand, navigates the same chapter in the following manner. Let us take the example of another subject. We find that it becomes difficult for Ajay to navigate a chapter on money and credit in the Class 10 economics textbook due to the insertion of a watermark.
Heading level 2. What does all this suggest? First, heading level 2. The formal sector still meets only about. Heading level 2. Half of the total credit needs of the. Heading level 2. Rural people. Heading level 2 needs are met from informal sources.
Samir, on the other hand, sees this. In the same chapter, an inaccessible graph means Ajay struggles to comprehend the following text.
Poor households, well-off rich. Households with few assets, households. Blue. Percent of loans from the informal sector, 85%. 15%. Purple. Percent of loans from the formal sector, 10%. 72%, 90%. 28%. 53%, 47%.
Meanwhile, Samir sees a text box with 4 pie charts that tell him the percentage of loans taken by different households from the formal and informal sector. As per Section 17.1 of the current law on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, suitable modifications in the curriculum and examination system must be made to meet the needs of students with disabilities, with Section 42.1 further specifying that all contents available in audio, print, and electronic media be in an accessible format. The Act eliminates all exemptions from science and mathematics education. When the onus of accessibility is on the state to adapt materials to the needs of all students, then why should these subjects still be inaccessible?
Right. So I hope that was firstly audible to everyone and that, there was no problem in sharing that. But essentially, the reason we wanted to show this video and the reason we created this video even is to show how very sort of basic and easily adjustable accommodations within teaching and learning material can have such an significant impact on the way a student with a visual disability is able to actually comprehend the content. And with that, I'm just going to get into the findings of this study. So, like we said, the Diksha platform hosts a variety of different resources. It has e-textbooks, it has supplementary learning materials, such as, PPTs, resources for teachers to teach, annotated notes, a range of different kinds of resources. And originally, when the Diksha platform was created, which was in 2017, the idea was to first make these supplementary resources accessible to a larger audience. And this also includes, non-government made, so private made, videos and audio clips and things like that. So it's mainly supplementary educational resources. However, with the COVID-19 pandemic and a little bit before that, the government has really encouraged educational institutions across the country to put up e-textbooks as well. So to put up basically primary teaching and learning resources for students for all subjects, grades, curriculum boards, etc. So we did a preliminary review of the resources that were hosted on the Diksha platform in January and February of this year, 2021. And we found that for most states on the platform, the main resource that was listed or had been uploaded were NCRT textbooks. And in many cases, for at least 20 of these, so there were about 20 states at that time that had NCRT textbooks hosted on the platform. And for many of these textbooks were the main textbook hosted, as in it was exclusively NCRT textbooks. And then in some states, you had only the state syllabus, so the SCERT textbooks hosted, not NCRT at all. So what we have done is we have selected um, chapters from NCRT textbooks. So that covers chapters listed for 20 states. And we've selected SCRT e-textbooks from two states of Telangana and Tamil Nadu. And we specifically chose these two states because these SCRT e-textbooks were one of the main resources hosted on their state lists, right? So they didn't have NCRT textbooks for sure, and they also had little other supplementary teaching and learning materials on that. So what we've done is essentially taken e-textbooks listed under 22 states at the time of data collection, within which we have selected a sample of chapters, right? So we first selected a sample of subjects. We covered English, math, science, geography, history, environmental studies, and social sciences. And we also covered chapters, these subjects for grades 1, 5, 8, and 10. And the idea with selecting a sample like this was to essentially try to get a sense of overall in the curriculum board, the e-textbooks that are hosted, what do they look like in terms of accessibility or inaccessibility, right? So when you go onto the Diksha platform, the way that it works is that a student uses a drop-down menu to select the medium of instruction. They select which state they want to look for materials under. They then select the subject that they're interested in, the grade that they're in, and based on that, they get a list of learning resources, which they can then open and download, etc. So these chapters try to cover a large base of the resources that are on the website and that are available to students. One limitation that we definitely had was because we were using screen reading software and we had multiple people using the screen reading softwares, we could specifically only look at textbooks that were in English medium. And that is a huge limitation. But as far as the platform is concerned, as I said, these materials that we've sampled do cover 22 states and the materials listed on 22 states. Right. So just to give you a clearer sense of what we mean when we say inaccessibility of these materials, so we have a sample of 65 chapters. And what we wanted to do was to first assess whether the Diksha platform's website and the mobile application for the platform, whether those themselves are independently navigable for a student with a visual disability. And a student with a visual disability would use a screen reading software to navigate the website or the mobile application. So our first sort of assessment, or the first aspect of the platform that we assess, is the actual website and mobile application. And the idea is to see if the student can, using a screen reading software, make the selection of state, subject, grade, and then find the chapter that they are looking for, and then independently open or download that chapter so that they can then actually read the materials, right? So that's the first step in access. The second thing that we do is we look at how accessible the 65 chapters we have sampled are. And over here, what we mean is that once a student is able to find the chapter they're looking for, they've either opened it or they've downloaded it in whatever format, are they able to use a screen reader to go through the actual chapter in a way where they are able to comprehend what the chapter is saying, or what the chapter covers in terms of topics, right? And this is obviously very, very basic. Without this, the child isn't really getting anything from having opened this chapter. So over here, the main thing that we look at is, one, whether the teaching learning material that we have downloaded, is that in an appropriate e-text format such that the screen reader is actually able to read it, right? And even if it's not in an e-text format, does it include certain inaccessible elements within it that make it inaccessible to a screen reader, right? Or at least those aspects or elements of it are inaccessible to a screen reader. And this includes things like images without captions, or tables that are, put in as images or are in an format that sort of changes the order in which it's read by a screen reader, or for example, watermarks, right? Which we saw in the video earlier, how difficult it can be if there's a watermark in the text as well. So this is what we mean when we talk about assessing the inaccessibility of the teaching and learning materials itself. And the third thing that we do is, for a subsample of the 65 chapters, so specifically for 22 chapters that we sampled from NCERT textbooks, we look at the types of learning activities or the types of learning problems and questions that are given within the chapter. And we try to understand whether these, in the way that they are designed, whether they are inaccessible for a student with visual disability, and again, how much of them are, right? And I'll explain this last bit in more detail as we go forward. But before that, we can move on to the others. So the method of testing, the way that we did this was, we had a team of 4 researchers working on this study. Tapas himself was the main research member, as a research team member who worked on this study. He himself has a visual disability himself. And what he did first was use 2 screen reading softwares, which are JAWS and NVDA, commonly used open access for most part. And he documented his experience of navigating the website and the mobile application of the Diksha platform. So that was step 1. In step 2, we gave him the learning resources that I spoke about, the 65 chapters, and we asked him to, again, give us a documentation of his experience going through those chapters. So tell us how much is accessible, how much isn't, how many chapters had inaccessible elements, etc. And then the last step was that the 3 other cited members of the research team used the screen reading software NVDA, which has a specific tool called the screen viewer. And what this tool does is that it essentially writes out everything that the screen reader is reading, right? So it allows a sighted person to do a clean accessibility check. So it's just like to double check what is actually on the page versus what the screen reader is reading out. So this was the process of testing the actual materials. Okay, finally, on to the findings. So to start with, the navigability of the web platform, right? So we found that the web platform or the website of the Diksha platform is largely inaccessible. And the mobile application fares much, much better than that. What's crucial to note here is that for a student with visual disabilities, even if a mobile application works really well, in most part, they would prefer to use a computer or a laptop or a desktop with a keyboard, because the screen reading softwares that are usually used have a lot of shortcuts and things like that that make it easier to navigate large chunks of material, especially things like books, textbooks, and things like that, through the use of a keyboard. So because of that, it's preferable for them to use the website, right? And essentially, this means that even though the mobile application of the Diksha platform is quite accessible, there weren't many large problems. It is very, very important for the website to also be accessible, regardless of the mobile application. And what we found on the website is that there are many inaccessible elements. We provided a couple of examples here, but many inaccessible elements that basically make it very difficult for a student with a visual disability to use a screen reader independently to actually search for the materials that they're looking for, and then ultimately be able to download or open it, right? And that's essentially what we mean when we say navigability. They need to be able to go onto the website and then put in, like I said before, subject, grade, the state that they're looking in, and the name of the chapter they're looking for, and then be able to download it. But what we found, for example, is there's a drop-down menu for medium of instruction, and in that, the screen reader isn't able to actually read out what the language options are. Instead, it just says clickable, clickable, clickable. So that obviously makes it impossible for a student with visual disability to select medium of instruction. Similar kinds of inaccessibility issues occur with other drop-down menus on the home page as well. Then once a student is able to ultimately find a list of the resources or chapters that they want to open or download, we found that even the links for those are not properly labeled. So again, that means that a student with visual disability can't actually download the materials to even open the chapter and read through it, right? So this is obviously a huge challenge, and one that needs to be addressed almost immediately if a student with visual disability is to use this platform at all. To give you a sense of how difficult it was to actually navigate links of learning resources, we ended up sending Tapas links to resources because he couldn't use the drop-down menus independently. We sent him links to a variety of different learning resources to ask him whether once you get to that page, is it still possible for you to download and open the materials? And of the sampled links we sent him, he could own 68.2% of those links were not accessible to him using a screen reader. Sorry, just a second. Yeah. The second thing we do, as I mentioned, is we look at the accessibility of the resources hosted on the platform. So here we've categorized accessibility in two ways, or inaccessibility in two ways rather. One is complete inaccessibility, where this usually occurs when the teaching and learning materials are not hosted in an appropriate e-text format, right? Or when multiple pages within the chapters are uploaded in inappropriate formats. So for example, one is chapters where the entire textbook has been scanned and uploaded as images. That is definitely not an appropriate e-text format, and a screen reader can't make head or tail of that. Similarly, within chapters, so the chapter itself has been uploaded as a PDF or a Word document, but then there are, say, tables within that or large chunks of text that have been uploaded as images. And to give you an example of why we've categorized this as complete inaccessibility of a chapter, there is an 8th grade mathematics chapter that we sampled, which consisted of 48 pages. And of those 48 pages, 70.1% of the pages were in an inappropriate e-text format, which essentially means that when your screen reader gets onto the chapter, it reads maybe the first 3 pages, and then it just skips a whole bunch of pages to the next accessible page. So for this chapter, the screen reader skipped through 70% of the chapter, which definitely means that a student won't be able to understand the content that's in that chapter. The second type of inaccessibility is partial inaccessibility, which is where the material is uploaded in an appropriate e-text format, so a Word document or a PDF, that the screen reader can actually go through. However, it contains these inaccessible elements like I spoke about before, right? So images, tables, graphs, watermarks. And again, images are not the problem, or tables and graphs aren't the problem. It's when they are in an inaccessible format or there is no captioning, and it essentially poses issues like the ones we saw in the video before. So this figure essentially shows us the level of inaccessibility in these two categories that I spoke about, right? So it's clubbed together complete and partial inaccessibility for all the sample chapters from NCRT, from the SCRT Tamil Nadu chapters and the SCRT Telangana chapters. And what we find is that 64% of the NCRT chapters are either completely or partially inaccessible. 95.5% of Tamil Nadu chapters are either completely or partially inaccessible, and 96% of Telangana chapters are completely or partially inaccessible. So this means for a student with visual disability studying from any of these e-textbooks, their ability to actually use these resources, I mean, it speaks for itself. It's very, very difficult for them to comprehend the entirety of what the text is saying. The next thing we do, which is the third type of inaccessibility we try to capture, is inaccessibility of the learning activities, right? Over here, what we mean by learning activities, and we've given an example in the slide as well, they're essentially questions or problems or activities that are provided within a chapter that help a child or a student understand new concepts and also help teachers gauge whether students are being able to understand these concepts, right? So the example that we've provided here is from a first grade mathematics textbook, which is teaching a pre-numeracy concept of thick and thin. The way this activity is framed is that students are shown this image of a thin pencil and a thick pencil, and they are asked to look at the image, identify which pencil is thicker than the other, and to circle or tick the thicker pencil. So, I mean, intuitively, right, it goes without saying that such an activity is not accessible for a student with a visual disability. And what is important to note here is that no alternative to such an activity is usually provided, right? So when we say we are now going to assess the inaccessibility of learning activities, these are the kinds of things that we essentially mean. So we look at what is the total number of learning activities across the 22 sampled NCRT chapters. And we find that across subjects and grades, there are 907 learning activities that, of course, feature different kinds of questions, problems, and activities to do in the classroom with your peers, etc. And what we find is that overall, 52.6% of these 907 learning activities are inaccessible for a student with visual disability. And this extent of inaccessibility of learning activities varies by grade and subject. And as highlighted in this slide, 80% of this inaccessibility shows up in mathematics chapters. And surprisingly, the grade 1 chapters that we selected, 94.2% of learning activities for grade 1 were inaccessible as well. And like I said, a main issue that crops up is that no alternative activities are provided, either for the student or for a teacher. So just to take you through very quickly, when we say that it varies by subject and grade, so this is the extent of inaccessibility of learning activities by subject. And as highlighted in the previous slide as well, mathematics has the highest amount of inaccessibility, followed by English, which was a bit of a surprise to us as well. Science was at about 33.9%. And the remaining subjects of geography, economics, history, which were the other subjects that we sampled in NCRT textbooks, these also had a relatively high amount of inaccessibility, with the exception of history, which did not have any inaccessible learning activities. But the number of learning activities for these three subjects is a little bit lower as well, because they're only available for the higher classes. So that obviously leads these numbers to a certain extent. But definitely for mathematics, English, and science, these numbers are quite crucial. In table 2, we look at inaccessibility of learning activities by grade. And like again highlighted previously, for grade 1, we had 138 learning activities across subjects and chapters, which were for English and math, and 94.2% of these were inaccessible, followed by grade 8, where 54.6% of learning activities were inaccessible, and then grade 10, where 48% was inaccessible. Again, it is possible that these numbers and the extent of inaccessibility within grades is led by the selection of subjects within those grades. So for that reason, we also compared basically inaccessibility of learning activities by grade and level of schooling, right? So within a specific subject, so of mathematics, we compared extent of inaccessibility for primary versus secondary grades, and we find there's no significant difference. In fact, it's extremely high, around 80% both ways. Similarly, for English, we looked at within English and across first grade, fifth grade, and eighth grade, what was the extent of inaccessibility. And interestingly, we found again that grade 1 is definitely more inaccessible. So it had 58.2% of inaccessible learning activities, whereas grade 5 had only 21.2%, which is comparatively definitely significantly lower. And the English chapter selected for grade 8 was not inaccessible at all, or it had no inaccessible learning activities. And then finally, we conducted a similar thing for science as well. And here, as expected for the lower grade of grade 5, like the number of inaccessible learning activities was lower at 13.4%. And then for grades 8 and 10, maybe because, you know, there's more and more mathematics and science as you go to higher grades, or it becomes more technical, it goes up to about 41 to 42%. Right. So these are essentially the findings of our study, right? We have looked at a large sample of e-textbooks, which are one of the primary learning resources that are used by students. And we've looked at inaccessibility within that in a bunch of different ways. And of course, to begin with, we were looking at web accessibility on the Diksha platform itself. But the extent of inaccessibility that we find in the actual learning materials and in the learning activities within chapters of the learning materials, it really points to a larger issue. It points to the idea that maybe within the design of our curriculum and the content that we present to students, maybe we're creating exclusion within the design of that itself. And really with this study, that's something that we want to talk about, right? So once we have sort of put into place these digital or web guidelines for making things accessible, is that still enough? Can we then say that we've reached inclusive education? So from here, I'm going to hand it over to Tapas to go over some of the recommendations from this study. And he will then lead us into our discussion with our esteemed speakers, who again, we really want to pose these questions to. Tapas, you can go ahead.
Um, Thank you, Nisha. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Good evening to one and all. The recommendations that we have provided in the report are based upon legislative frameworks and other policies that have been brought in place by the government and international agencies in order to provide a non-discriminatory, equal, and an accessible environment for all, including persons with disabilities. These recommendations pertain to two significant issues in relation to education of children with disabilities, that is, making digital education accessible for all and making teaching learning material accessible for all. In the latter segment of our recommendations, we have strived to move beyond web accessibility. This study finds that more than half of the learning activities in textbooks across subjects and grades are inaccessible for students with visual impairment. This suggests that even if the guidelines for web accessibility are met, the true impediment to inclusion in the classroom is built in into the curriculum. Now, let me present before you the first set of recommendations that are dealing with making digital education accessible for all. Make the Diksha web platform and the mobile application universally accessible for all. Rule 15 1C subpart 1 of the Rights of Persons with Disability rules of 2017 mandates adoption of guidelines developed by the Indian government for government run websites. These are known as GIGW guidelines. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India also released guidelines on making ICT, that is the information and communication technology, accessible for all, including persons with disabilities. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that is WCAG 2.1, that is the latest version that we have, released by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, also paves a way for an accessible web experience. And that is for persons with visual disabilities. The next recommendations says that conduct a systematic audit of this audit relates to the accessibility of the Diksha web platform. So therefore we say that there should be a systematic audit of the Diksha web platform to ensure that it meets universal standards of accessibility. Given the dynamic nature of platform and resources hosted on it, such a check should necessarily be done routinely. So it is not that we have uploaded a particular book and a particular material is uploaded and our job is done. A proper monitoring mechanism also needs to be in place. Rule 15 1C subpart 2 of the Rights of Persons with Disability rules of 2017 mandates that documents that are placed on website shall be in electronic publication, that is EPUB format, or optical character reader, that is OCR based PDF format. The process of approval of teaching learning material on the Diksha platform should include an accessibility check of material and the format in which they have been uploaded to minimize the uploading of the content in violation of these rules. Amend the schedule to the RTE, that is the Right to Education Act of 2009, which has paved a way for education for all till grade 8th. So, given the increased focus on the digital education in the National Education Policy 2020 and necessitated by the current pandemic in which we are in today, the schedule to the RTE should be amended to include norms and standards on inclusive digital education that are applicable to school. Nisha, I will request you to turn on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, yeah.
Moving on to the second part of our recommendations that deal with making teaching learning material accessible for all. This report recommends that Section 17A of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016 directs government authorities to conduct survey of school-going children in every 5 years for identifying children with disabilities, ascertaining their special needs and the extent to which they are being met. The process of ascertaining whether the needs of students are being met should necessarily include accessibility checks on the TLM provided to and used by students across disability types. Subsection 17(1) and subsection 17A of the RPWD Act, when read together, requires that all TLM be reviewed systematically and regularly to ensure that curriculum does not exclude students with varying disabilities by designs. Where inaccessible, learning activities should be altered for greater inclusion and alternatives must be provided for teaching the students, that is for both the teachers and the students, where they cannot be altered. Universal accessibility norms should be made an integral part of the content creation process rather than a supplementary exercise. And this applies for the web platform as well. First the platform is created and then we check that whether it is accessible or not. However, it should be vice versa. Accessibility is something which should be included in the work culture. We also recommend that Diksha platform should encourage and host resources that provide pedagogical directions for inclusions of students with disabilities. So these are some of the recommendations that we have suggested in our report, and we definitely believe that these recommendations, um, uh, if adopted, can pave a way for an accessible environment. And we at Vidhi would love to contribute in whatever ways we can to make an accessible environment for children with disabilities, which include children with diverse disabilities. With this, we come to end of our recommendation sections. Today, we have with us Dr. Ruma Banerjee, Chairperson, Seva in Action, and Member, Central Advisory Board, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Government of India, to share her thoughts with us on this issue. And I would request my colleague and team leader at Vidhi, Nisha Varnikar, to please carry forward the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tapas. So I think the last set of recommendations that Tapas spoke about, primarily on making teaching and learning materials accessible for all students, I think this ties in almost directly with some of the work that you have done, ma'am. Ma'am, would it be possible for you to turn on your video if you're comfortable?
Yes, yes. Sorry. Yeah, please tell.
Yeah, so like I said, you've been on the CABD, and you've in fact written a chapter on pedagogical practices, for cross disability training of teachers, and in that you specifically talk about teaching and learning materials as well, right? And the
Yes.
process of making that accessible, or how we can do that. So maybe we can start on this note. Like, how do you feel like we need to move forward in supporting teachers, so that they can actually teach students with disabilities in their class?
Yeah. Thanks, Nisha. First of all, inviting me for this very enriching and very useful study that you all have done. And more specifically, I should say, is this is the need of the hour, looking into the whole situation, what the world is going into. I totally agree with what you all have been recommending, and you all have been suggesting. See, the whole, the foundation of learning children with diversities, when we talk about the whole learning process in an inclusive classroom, the whole issue lies on like how accessible we are making the whole learning process for these children. And when we say how accessible we are trying to make this learning process, there are a lot of aspects that come into it, which starts from the teachers, how the teachers are equipped, how the teachers are able to make the environment more learner friendly. And when we're talking about how the teachers are trying to make the environment learner friendly, I think the TLMs, what you are sharing, has a very important part, because any learning and any teaching, what we say, cannot happen in an abstract form when it comes to any child. It is not only for children with disabilities. We are talking about any child in a class, in a learning environment. And this whole process of creating this learning material uh, would actually, it is supporting the whole process of teaching or learning for the child. And these TLMs, preparing these TLMs, it has this also an objective, means how are we meeting the learning objectives of the child. Like, for example, when you have a child, when you have a topic, because as another thing, as you know, the whole situation of learning in or you can say the education system is so much textbook based in our country, and it is like the textbooks are taken as a TLM for the teachers. So whatever is mentioned in the textbook, that is what it just no, that they try to just copy and just share that with the children. But textbooks are not just the TLMs for it. That means the TLMs or the learning materials go far more than that, and it depends also on the learning objective of a particular level of the child, whether it is the subject, whether it is the class. So when you're looking into the learning objective, so how to meet that learning objective, whether it is the language, if you're going to teach a language for the child, a basic concept about maybe the uh, knowing about the environment, or reading a chapter, reading a prose, reading some literature. So how are you going to enable that child to learn that objective if it is a subject like language? So in that perspective, we need to have different ways and methods of teaching, and that is where the different it needs to have more of a multisensorial approach of learning, where we can develop such materials which helps the child not only to learn through one of the senses, but how we are using the different senses. See, another thing I think we need to realize, especially when the people who are working in the whole sphere of inclusive education, like we are talking about diverse learners. We are talking about an environment where the learning has its own varied form. And it doesn't only no, rely on children with maybe disabilities, but maybe there would be children who require time to learn a certain concept. There would be children disabilities who may be only learning through the visual forms. There would be children with disabilities who would be have a way of through hearing they are able to learn better. Some children, like for example, when you talk about autistic children or children having, they require a more isolated or individual way of learning. Some may learn better in a group. So when we are talking about the whole aspect of diverse learning forms for children, that is where it is very important, like we come uh, and try to understand how these learning materials would be used as a learning activity for the child. So, for example, means as you said, no, we did. In fact, when we were working with the DSCRT Karnataka in incorporating inclusive education as one of the component, which goes as more as a permeated way in teacher education, in a pre-service teacher education. So Karnataka was what you say, revising its whole syllabus, 2 year syllabus of the D.Ed program, that is for pre-service teacher training, which caters to class 1 to 8. So that is where we got together with the educationist, because this is we need to see whole education of children with disabilities more from an education lens rather than from a disability lens. I think that is the first and foremost that we need to understand. So that is where the whole concept we started at, if it has to go as a permeated approach in the education system, we need to really understand like how in each and every aspect, starting from understanding the whole concept of education, understanding how to facilitate learning in different subjects, it has to permeate in an inclusive way. Means it is not like we add an add-on chapter in the whole curriculum for the teachers, like, yeah, this is what is disability, this is how you identify, this is how you assess, and that is what it limits to. I think here we try to go a little further to make them to understand how learning, how you facilitate learning when you have diverse learners in your classroom. It is not disabled learners with disability, but a diversity. So that was the major aspect that this was taken into. And that is where we we developed these resource centers at the district level. We call it as the diets. So at a diet level, how these teaching learning materials could be developed in collaboration or in synergy with the special educators, with regular teachers, with teacher educators, where we come together and look into a concept. Like if, for example, if you have to teach maths, as you said, if you have to teach a language subject, so how we work together from a special needs angle from a regular curriculum, like how it fits into, if the child has a need, a unique need which needs to be met. So how do we develop that material which will enable that child? It requires more of a visual material. It requires an activity-based learning where you encourage the child to participate. For example, for the language subjects and all, no, we had made large reading books, like which had fonts of bigger sizes, which had also visuals, and it was a sort of a big book made so that the child also, no, can hold that book. The child can come near that book and try to read. The child can see the pictures in the book. Of course, all these materials are there in one of our sites. It is uploaded. So like that, we took into what you say confidence the regular teachers, because they know the curriculum, what is there in the regular curriculum, and how those adjustments or how those inclusive patterns need to be developed. Because what we have seen over a period of years working with the regular teachers, that they have enough experience in working with the regular curriculum. What was required over there is to enable them or help them to understand what is that special need for the child. If the child is not able to see, if you are trying to teach a concept in an environment science or science, the child is not able to see that. So if the child cannot see that object, to see that, how the other aspects we need to develop through hearing, through tactile, make those materials with the child would be able to understand. So this is how we work, collaborated together with regular teachers, special teachers, to come out with the appropriate teaching materials which enables or helps the child in learning. And it is, means it has to be a work together and understanding, and have that confidence in teachers that they can do it. Definitely they can do it. Only thing is we have to facilitate and make them realize, like, there is a special need, make them to realize there is a diversity in the learning atmosphere. So that needs to be kept in mind. So
Right.
that's what.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you bring up two very interesting points. One is, of course, the idea that what we care about is not really about disability, but about diversity in learning. And that's really what we need to address in the classroom and in creation of content and curriculum. And then also this, what you're talking about these resources that have been made in the context of Karnataka. So, okay, I have two questions here. One is, when you talk about this diversity and creation of diverse curriculum and content, and I mean, even pedagogy, it brings us to the idea of universal design learning, right? So if you would be able to sort of give our audience a sense of what that concept is, I think that would be really helpful. And the second question is sort of these materials that you're talking about, this material that's been created with the help of special educators and regular or mainstream teachers to meet the needs of these diverse learners. It seems that there are a lot of these kinds of materials and teaching learning resources that do exist already. They're out there on different platforms. So why aren't they available to everyone? Because we really don't need to be reinventing the wheel every time. So yeah, I mean, whichever order you want to go in, ma'am.
Absolutely right, Nisha, what you said. Like, we need not reinvent wheels. So, but before that, just to say, like, when we talk about this whole issue of inclusive learning, I think the most important aspect, or the most important educational framework now that we are all talking about, is the universal design for learning, as we all know. Whoever know, we are all working in this field of inclusive education. uh, yeah, I'm not directly working with UDL, but yes, we are developing or we are promoting this whole concept of UDL in both what you say, in the special teacher education programs, where RCI, we had developed that I inclusive education training program. At the same time, also in the regular teacher education program, like recently we have a refreshing training program with tests and all. So there also we are promoting this whole concept of universal design for learning. So see, this whole concept of universal design of learning is, if you see the word itself, like now that when we say inclusion, and and also we try to realize that there is diversity in learning, so it becomes essential, like any learning thing, it should be any concept, any learning should be universally, uh, people should be able to access that in, or to be able to learn that for all. So the learning for it also develops from the whole concept for learning for all, the universal design. So any education should be accessible to all, and they should be enabled to learn. So the universal design basically is talking about a flexibility in the learning, multiple approaches in learning, so that the child or the person, whoever is learning, can act, that can have a different ways and forms of learning. For example, there are basically three aspects that universal design for learning they're talking is. One is the whole understanding of the concept in a different forms, like how the child, how are you making the child, how you're making the concept accessible to the child, or what is it the child is trying to learn in different ways and forms. Like there would be limitations in his sensorial development, there would be limitations maybe in cognitive development, no, which is through the child learns. So are your learning concept, are you putting are you representing your concept in a way a child with limitations with sensorial or cognitive can understand, like how multisensorial approaches you're using, are you using just visual, or you're also having visual and auditory, plus you are having a way of making the concept understand better. That is one of the first and foremost thing they are talking about in universal design. The second is how, as you know, you all dealt, were explaining, how are you engaging the child, that is the activities, like how accessible are those activities that you are trying to make for the child, so that the child is motivated to learn. So again, it has to be looked into the accessible activities under the universal design that you are making, the different ways and forms. It is not only the child learning through seeing, or not only just hearing, or just no, making some rote learning or representing in a visual format. So what are the different ways and formats you are trying to engage the child with in the learning? And the third component is the different modes of expression, that also the recommendations that you all came up to, like whether it is only just writing and giving the exams, and in a written form you're asking the child to express, but are there different ways, whether the child can say orally, whether the child has some other way of presenting by actions or something else. So universal design is basically talking about the whole accessibility of understanding of what they are learning, why they are learning, and how they are learning. And this is what needs to be really what to say, promoted and developed for teacher education right now, because this is a very important thing that it is required. and yes, if you have to do all these materials for the for the UDL manually, definitely it is a big challenge, no, making all the materials in a 3D form or a visual form. So here it is where your digital no, technology is of immense use, and you have enough, as you said, you have enough open education resources uh, available already there in the web. So I think we have to play a little more proactive role as teachers, as educators, to identify these, no, what you say, resources which is there, and use it. Whether you are trying to represent, no, make the child understand how you use the open education resources for the reading, for preparing. If you're trying to have activities, so even you have resources there, how to organize the activities for the child, and of course also for the expression. And I think there are schools like Gateway School in Mumbai and all, what I was seeing, and we have been working, they looked into it a little more in details, like how the universal design for learning could be developed by the teachers using the uh, existing digital technology, or existing open education resources, which is already there. And we are also trying to come out with the resources, what you say, virtual resources, a platform for inclusive education virtual resources where these children can have access to all these different type of resources, the teachers, the parents, and we have to see the child. Yes, one major challenge that we are having over here is the resources, and what you all have also done this study is for the higher education, because most of the resources that we see, in fact, NCRT also has developed Barkha,
Yeah.
the reading materials, which is for the primary level, of course, for level 1 and 2. No doubt it is for under the UDL no, principles. But what we are observing now is like we don't have enough resources for the middle and high school. And that is where the whole challenge is coming. And that is what you all also did a study here with this. Of course, this was you all have done specifically for visual impairment, but I think there are enough challenges for the other diverse needs also when it comes to the higher education and resources that I feel.
Right. 100%. Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
Ma'am, more
Yeah,
importantly, when we are talking about you are aware that the Rights of Persons with Disability Act defines inclusive education, where we are integrating both the children with and without disabilities. So, how do you see these principles being incorporated towards moving to an inclusive environment in a classroom setting, and more importantly in the states, because we do know that each state in our country has its own board and has its own course which is being prescribed. So how do you see this development, and if you would like to comment upon this?
Uh, See, RT Act, of course, has come a long time back, 2009, and from there, the respective states have made their own state rules based on the larger, it was the national rules, and they made it more specific. And of course, that is what is required because disability is a state subject, and it is the mandatory of the state to develop its rules based on their needs, based on their requirements of the children. And definitely a lot has happened based on the RT rules, like but the but yes, in some ways there has been also a gaps when it came just for implementing some of the rules when it came to no, the admission in the private schools. See, government schools, definitely it is open for children with disabilities, and children with disabilities are already there in government school. Yes, the challenge they were having was in private schools, and you must be aware of all the schemes of the government. So whenever, because Government of India has played a very proactive role in inclusion of children with disability, starting from NP 85, where we had the IDSS scheme, where we had the DP, and then we had the DPP program, District Primary Education Program, inshallah. Then the major program we came to is the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which really took inclusive education in a major way, taking to all the districts. And now we are having the Samagra Shiksha. So uh, uh, under RT has definitely taken up a lot of no, based on the state issues and subjects, they have definitely implemented many things. But yes, there are still many challenges that needs to be implemented, especially when it now comes into the whole inclusive education component, because I think it has to be harmonized with the RPD Act 2016, and that is what to say, it has been also recommended by the educational panelists and from NCRT, like how we harmonize RPD, because now, as you know, with the RPD 16, inclusive education has become only the means for education, whereas RPD also has given an option with the home-based education, which was a major debate that we had during those times. It has given an option where the child can come to the school, or even you can provide with home-based education. But it needs harmonization, and RPD 16 law has definitely the Samagra Shiksha program of Government of India, which is now being implemented, is taking into consideration a lot of the components of inclusive education, going further than what RT has mandated.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Nisha, if you could carry
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah, so I mean, this sort of brings the, because you're right, there is implementation that is happening. I think what's sort of striking is the idea that the legal mandates seem to all be there. So, like Tapa said, even though we do need to sort of update specifically the Right to Education Act, we do have the RPD Act. We do have it telling us, or giving us this very strong legislative framework for inclusive education and like inclusiveness in society for people across diverse disabilities. And we also, like you said, seem to have the materials. They seem to be things that already exist out there. There's enough resources, enough knowledge. So I mean, really, where is the gap coming from there? Like, why is it possible for us to have such an amazing platform that hosts so many materials and to have such a high extent of inaccessibility? Like, how is this gap happening then? And how do we sort of move from here? What do we do next?
Uh, See, um, it's quite a tricky question you have asked.
I know.
And for me, see, another challenge that we are having in India is education for children with disabilities under two ministries. So we have the HRD ministry, which is actually responsible for education. And we also have the Ministry of Social Justice. But with NEP coming into force, the National Education Policy, I think the mandate of education for children with disabilities to, by and large extent, comes under the National Education Policy now. And I think things will be much, much better for implementation when it is under the whole education platform, because here you also have that is what happens. Sometimes the teachers, they say, as you know, some of the realities, it is not my responsibility, it is the special educator's responsibility when it comes to the whole inclusion. And then this, we don't have enough special educators who would be able to reach all the schools, and that is not also what you say something which is possible to do, having special educators, because education is a fundamental right in our country now, we know, and the RT, that is what RT has given it. When education is a fundamental right, so any teacher has the responsibility of providing to every child. So that is the first thing, that the realization has to take place. So the gap, what you are asking, one is lies between the whole development of our regular teachers. See, the pre-service teacher education did not have that much emphasis on the whole aspect of inclusive education and diversity and every child. Now all we have, from the past, I think, 4 or 5 years, it is coming under the pre-service, and the B.Ed program now has an inclusive education. It has gone, of course, just as a module, but anyway, it has gone into the course. So equipping the regular teachers, until regular teachers are, you change the attitude, you equip their capacities, you equip their skills, how to deal in an inclusive classroom, this gap will be there. And this will happen when the pre-service teacher education program develops to meet the needs of all children, and inclusive education becomes a permeated approach in the whole course curriculum rather than an add-on program and module. So this is where the gap is, and that is where we are having the challenges. So that is what we have realized working in this field for the past 2 decades.
Right, right. Okay, absolutely. Thank you so much for this, ma'am. I'm just going to open the floor to some questions. Pooja, have we got...
Nisha, Amar is also joining us in a moment. Till then, we can definitely take the questions
Yeah,
from the audience as well.
perfect. Pooja, were there any questions? If anyone's put anything into the chat boxes, do let us know.
Yes, there are a lot of, but we have...
Yeah, there are a lot of comments generally, questions, nothing as such. I can start reading some of the comments if that's going to be helpful, probably.
Sure.
So some Carmo has commented saying they've congratulated us for the work, and they've said that another aspect is the accessibility of the assessment. Learning without formative assessment of self-assessment is incomplete, and this is a great challenge for persons with disabilities. So this is what they've commented generally. There's no question here.
Okay.
That's about it. Yeah, people can now probably post their questions after this entire thing.
Okay. So luckily, Amar Jain has been able to join us. I think he's just come on board. Thank you so much for being able to make it, Amar. I know it was a bit of a challenge today.
My sincere apologies for that. It was just unavoidable, and which is why I'm not able to even switch on my video because I'm logging from my office system. But my sincere apologies.
No, no, absolutely. No problem. Thank you so much for being here. So, I mean, I know you've missed some of the presentation, but we've shared this report and our findings with you before. So we just
Sure,
had a, couple of questions for you if we can do that.
sure,
Amar?
sure.
Um, Thank you, Amar, for joining us. There was a pill, which was pill is public interest litigation, which was filed with the Bombay High Court in October 2020 in relation to accessibility of Diksha platform. So,
That's
if
right.
you can, if you could let us know about the present status, and if you could make the audience aware about the same as to how the progress is being done.
Sure, sure, Tapas. So I think I'm not sure, and my apologies if this is already covered, but let me just briefly cover it in the sense that our current disability law, which is Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, casts an obligation on both private and government entities to make their public facilities and services accessible. And public services, facilities and services also include education. So NCRT had designed ePathshala and Diksha. These are the two platforms on which they offer digital content, which is also being used by the teachers to teach as well as for the students to read through. Apparently, it turned out to be that somewhere around July, this whole discussion started that Diksha and ePathshala both are not accessible for people with visual disability specifically. And what really happened is that there were two types of problem. One problem was the content issue, and second problem was the digital portal accessibility issue itself. So in both ways, people with visual impairment were hampered. So then I think what was decided within NAB was to file a public interest litigation, which was filed uh, somewhere in July, and then October onwards, hearing happened and all of that happened. As at present, what has happened really, so after filing the public interest litigation in the first hearing, a representation was made. A couple of us had given audit reports to convey how it is not accessible. So court had asked the advocate to present names of some experts who can actually make these portals and content accessible. And I was one of the nominated experts there. What happened then was that NCERT conducted a meeting somewhere in November, and they basically took our assessment. Sorry. So they took the questions from so the assessments from us and sort of understood what the problems are and sort of they designed the plan in which they plan to do some remediation in immediate remediation to iron out the high priority bugs, and then going forward they will take up the proper audit and remediation measures. So at present, what is happening is that they are working with their internal developers to make sure that they are able to at least iron out the critical bugs, as I said, and they are also in process of rolling out a tender to appoint an agency which can actually take care of the accessibility issues. But it's a long-term plan. Even on the content side, they are looking to make their master publishing files accessible, which was also a sad part of this is that last year this whole exercise was done as far as the content is concerned. But this year when they started publishing the content, again, same issues happened. But the good effect of all of that mistakes is that Ministry of Education has finalized the content guidelines. I'm sure somebody would have touched, maybe Ruma ma'am or somebody else would have touched upon it. So that I think is a positive step. So that's where the and litigation as of now is as it is. We are waiting further hearings and progress in the matter.
Sure,
So
sure,
that's
sure. So Amar, Dr. Banerjee and Nisha, everyone was just discussing about reinventing the wheel again and again, which is a problem
That's right.
So how do we move towards all content for digital education being 100% accessible? And do these material already exist, or do we need to create this, such as, there was this ISLR-TC
Right.
memorandum of understanding to convert NCRT material into Indian Sign Language.
Right.
And we have found in our report that the material, if it is available, it is not in the appropriate EPUB format or the OCR PDF based format. So
Mhm.
how do you want to comment upon this?
See, so there are two, three key suggestions, which in fact, and that's a very valid question which you have, Tapas, and that's really the critical problem we all have been facing, and not just NCRT, with all the public and private players that at least I have been working with to make things accessible. That's the problem. Very first thing which needs to happen that is that the fact that the accessibility has to be core component of their request for proposal or any sort of checklist internal policy which they adopt. That I think is missing, because accessibility could have been very well been a part of the request for proposal itself when Diksha and ePathshala were outsourced to the vendors. Just so that's first point. The second point, which is also critical, is that none of these authorities or bodies have any mechanism wherein a person with disability, whether it is a teacher or a student, can go and sort of at least let them know that there is an issue with regard to accessibility, and this needs to be fixed. So the problem is that if you write to their IT people, they don't understand the issue half of the times. Sometimes they understand, but they say that this is out of our control because it's an outsourced application to the vendor. We have noted your feedback, we'll do the needful, or we'll evaluate and do the needful, which actually never happens. So the second suggestion which we have made is that they should have either a dedicated consultant, at least, if not in-house role, but at least a consultant role for accessibility professionals. And if not that, then at least have a pool of people who are good at accessibility, and anything that you do, whether it is new or whether it is existing, you basically make sure that they get to test before it is rolled out to the larger public. The third thing which you talked about, making existing infrastructure accessible, some of it needs to be done. So some for example, a large part of educational content is still not in accessible format. You rightly said about EPUB and OCR based PDFs. So that exercise needs to be taken. That can be done. There are ways to do it if they follow PDF standards, universal accessibility standards on PDF designing, set which is also an ISO standard. This is all doable. Most of the softwares also have accessibility wizard through which you can at least do the basic tick check of whether the document is accessible or not. So if even if they start doing that kind of exercise, and of course based on some practical feedback from people who are in the same profession, this can definitely be done.
Uh, Definitely. And Amar, Ruma ma'am has very categorically stated about the principles of universal design learning, which is an
That's
integral
right.
part of our education.
That's
So
right.
I would like to ask you that, is UDL part of our Indian policy, on disability, specifically education policy? We see this has been implemented in US K-12 education policy. However,
Right.
the primary, I mean, it has been for primarily for the content assessment. Uh,
Right. Right.
so, uh, where would we like to see this, and how would this help?
UDL framework, to be honest, our Indian system, at least in okay, the one thing I would, let's take NEP for to begin with. In the national education policy about disabilities, very limited mention. There is mention of disability and needs of accessibility and needs of people, but a very limited mention. I am told, and I that policy was adopted somewhere around 2018-19. on ICT and otherwise, in which they have taken into account needs or principles arising out of UDL. But the problem is that, we have many policies. India has many policies. We started, I think, right in 2006. We had one policy on universal products. Then around 2013 came the electronics policy, and so on and so forth. I'm slightly diverse, moving away from the context to give you the color of what's happening. We have many policies, but policies remain on paper, and for implementation there is no mechanism. That is the strongest challenge which we face today, that for implementation, since there is no strong mechanism, only having things in policy doesn't help. So that's really the critical issue.
Sure. I mean, we have a lot of frameworks, but less of work, unfortunately. This
That's
is
right.
a kind of. I would like to request Nisha to carry forward the discussion, please.
Thank you, guys, and once again, apologies.
No, of course, Amit. Thank you so much. I mean, this has already been super insightful. So you're saying, I mean, the main issue seems to be on there being no implementation mechanisms, right? And I guess the sort of last question that we can ask is, what do we do now then? How do we move forward? How do we work on creating that mechanism?
Sure. So Nisha, one quick sort of thought which comes to my mind: we need to create more and more people within our communities itself. We need to empower them with the knowledge of how things can be made accessible, how accessibility can be introduced at the same time. So training modules is one solution. So sensitization and training modules for people who are within the community, for people who are within the systems, be it education system or otherwise. We need to have proper modules within the curriculum. That could be a good solution. Second, as I said, accessibility needs to be part of each and every sort of whether it is an internal policy or it's a request for proposal, any sort of documentation that people do for getting any solution onboarded. Accessibility needs to be a part of it. Third thing, which is also important, is that review processes need to take place. So there needs to be proper review from time to time. And fourth, but not last but not least, there needs to be a dedicated grievance redressal mechanism apart from the chief commissioner and state commissioner for persons with disabilities within the organizations, wherein simple accessibility complaints can be taken care of, so that for every small accessibility issue, one need not file a case before commissioner for persons with disability.
Right. Absolutely. And I think an important point that Ruma ma'am had brought up also was the sort of issue of coordination between different departments, right? So specifically in the context of education that we're talking about, you have MSJ and you have the Ministry of Education itself. And it's basically a lot of coordination that has to happen between many different departments, teams, and programs before anything can actually be done. And so that
That's
question,
right.
yeah, I mean, there's always a question, even for us, right? Even now we have these findings, and there is this question of who is the best person to go to. So we know the accessibility, like the onus of accessibility is on the state, but who in the state, right?
Desha, I just would like to quickly mention here, this is coming from my experience itself. While this was in context of guidelines for accessibility in relation to ICT for private players, I had actually reached out to Department of Disability Affairs, MSJ, saying that you are the nodal ministry to implement disability related legislative matters. Why don't you take up with the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology? Their answer has been very categorical. They've been very clear that we are only resource persons to facilitate if a ministry wants to adopt something in relation to accessibility. If they come to us, we are happy to help them in terms of resources. But each ministry itself is responsible for implementing its own accessibility agenda. So since you asked who's the best ministry to go to for education, it will be the Ministry of Education.
Right. Right.
So increased channel for us there.
Yeah. No, that's definitely helpful. Right. Okay. Tapas, were there any other questions from you?
No, thank you, Nisha.
Okay, so we have one question on the chat group. So I'll just read the, okay, this is not really a question. Okay, so this is someone named Alva Kapasi, and she said she has something to share. So sorry, with Ruma ma'am, I think. Just a second. So she says, so I have something to share before, as shared by Ruma ma'am. Government schools are open to inclusion, but the teachers are not equipped to handle the children with deficiencies. So we as an NGO have been working with some government schools since the last 3 to 4 years and have been observing this. Hence, we provide these schools with counseling and remediation for children, but this can do with only some schools. Okay, and essentially she's asking that they would like to offer their services to other government schools and authorities concerned. And she's sort of asking where they can sort of, or how they can reach out to more government schools.
Where is this?
She has
Which place?
It's in the Q&A box, and I think
No, where is she working? Yes, I saw that. Narva. Where is she working?
Not sure.
That is not mentioned, I think, ma'am.
Maybe she can get in touch with us directly and send my.
Yeah.
Because there are government, I think, always looks forward for getting all the support, from NGOs, no doubt, because that is where the major challenges with the government, that they may not be having the expertise in teacher education. And there are many, officers at the level, like if it is at the district level, she wants to approach. We have the DYPC, we have the district, the officials there, commissioner, education commissioners, and all there, who are ready to know where she can go, and it depends like what sort of support you want to give. So you should have a clarity, like whether you want to do specific teacher education, you want to take teachers, you're going to help children directly, or provide, as you said, remedial education and give them, take some time before the school, or so what exactly, and basically what exactly the need is, I think you have to discuss with them, like what exactly they are looking for, and then plan out. It should not be a problem because they will be always open for such support.
Right, absolutely. So we'll put her in touch with you directly.
Sure. Yeah.
That should be fine. Okay, so if there are no other questions, or ma'am and Amar, if there's anything else you'd like to share before we close, please feel free to.
I think such studies are really, I should say, very useful, and this is where you bring out the real, what you are saying now, the challenges in implementation. So I think that is where, if we can focus on what is which is required to actually implement, whether there is and come out with very concrete recommendations, because if we give a whole lot of recommendations, maybe they may not take. But if I can get some specific recommendations, especially when this was brought out very well by Amar, like you need to have dedicated persons for doing accessibility, because I think there is no dearth of resources. So, but we require persons who know this both from both angles, like from the ICT perspective and from the needs perspective. So, and they should have such people. So I would be happy to get these such recommendations, and maybe would be able to forward it when we have our future meetings, and ask them to bring this into the agenda for the meetings. Definitely.
Right. Absolutely. Amar, anything else from your end?
I think I will just like to say, in addition to what Uma ma'am said, firstly, I echo with ma'am. Absolutely right. We need to give concrete recommendations, and I think we need to engage more with the Disability Advisory Board, both at the central level and otherwise at the state level. We have the Coordination Council. That's very important. Lastly, I think it's also important for the people who already know a bit of either accessibility, as ma'am said, we need to inculcate a culture of pro bono service. So sometimes, government wants to do, but they don't have whether the right funding resources or right people to get the task done. So we need to inculcate a culture of pro bono service in that sense, and doing a good job delivering good there. So that I think is my ask from people at large, that if there is, let's say, somebody from IT background may not know accessibility but knows IT well, and can be put in touch with somebody who knows accessibility, then together we can implement a good solution which is workable for public at large. So I think that's important.
Right, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Ruma ma'am and Amar, for all your points and for this discussion, for attending our event. This has been extremely insightful, and we're so happy we were able to have you for this. Just to announce, the report has also been put up on the website now, so that is available on Vidhi's homepage, and I think it has also been shared as a link on the chat box for everyone attending. And with that, I'd just like to give a final vote of thanks, of course, to our esteemed speakers. Once again, thank you so much for making the time and joining this
Thank you so
discussion.
much.
Thanks a lot.
And to my team, Tapas, Pooja, Jasmeet, I hope I didn't miss out anyone. Of course, to Preeti and Nithika, our sign language interpreters. This is the third time I think they have joined us for an event, and we're very, very grateful. Yeah, I think that's it. I hope I have not missed anyone out. And finally, of course, thank you everyone who attended. We really hope you enjoy reading this report. And like I said, where, you know, our entire aim with all this kind of research that we do is to take it forward, work on what that next gap is. So if anyone is interested and, you know, wants to share ideas of how we can do that, please reach out to us. Pooja's email address and mine and Tapas is all available on our website. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks.
And I think we will.
Thank you guys. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.